She humiliated a man in a crowded elevator because she thought he was just staff. Days later, trapped alone in the dark during a power outage, the only person who stayed calm and saved her was the same man she looked down on. What she didn't expect was that this moment would quietly change everything she believed about power, pride, and love. The morning Amelia Rhodes snapped at the man in the elevator began like every other morning of her life, rushed, controlled, and stripped of anything that didn't serve momentum. Because at 42, Amelia Rhodes had trained herself to believe that efficiency was the highest form of intelligence and hesitation was weakness. The lobby of her company's glass tower was buzzing when she arrived, assistants murmuring into headsets, executives glancing at watches, security holding doors, and when the public elevator doors slid open, she stepped in without looking at anyone, already reviewing numbers in her head for a meeting that could swing billions. The elevator filled quickly, shoulders brushing, briefcases pressed tight, and that's when she noticed him near the back, a man holding a plain metal lunchbox in one hand and a small, slightly worn backpack in the other, the kind with cartoon patches stitched on the front, and beside him stood a little girl, no older than 8, gripping his leg with quiet patience. To Amelia, the image registered instantly and inaccurately. Staff, wrong elevator, inconvenience. Her irritation surfaced before curiosity ever could. She sighed loudly, glanced at her watch, and said, sharp enough for the entire elevator to hear, "Staff should be using the service lift. You're blocking space." The car fell silent. The man looked up, surprised but calm, his eyes steady rather than defensive, and he shifted slightly, trying to make room without pushing anyone. Amelia didn't stop there. "We're already late. Please step aside," she added, her tone clipped, professional, dismissive, the way she spoke to problems she expected to disappear. The little girl looked up at him, confused, tightening her grip. The man lowered his head just enough to be respectful, not submissive, and said quietly, "Sorry about that," before adjusting his stance so others could pass more easily. No argument, no explanation, no correction. The doors closed, the elevator moved, and Amelia turned back to her thoughts, satisfied the disruption had been handled. She didn't notice the way a few people avoided her eyes. She didn't notice the discomfort that lingered in the silence. She didn't notice that the man she had dismissed so easily was not wearing a uniform, not wearing a badge, not standing there because he worked for her, but because life required him to be exactly where he was, with his daughter, every morning, carrying both responsibility and love in his hands. To Amelia, he was already gone, filed away as an insignificant delay in an otherwise important day. She had no idea that this man, Daniel, the one she reduced to a label in under 3 seconds, would soon become the only steady presence she could cling to when her world of private elevators, power, and control finally came to a stop. Daniel's mornings did not begin with boardrooms or assistants or glass towers reflecting status back at him. They began before sunrise, when the apartment was quiet and the city outside still felt half asleep, because being a single father meant time was never really his own. Daniel moved through those early hours with practiced efficiency, packing a simple lunch into the same dented metal box he'd carried for years, tying his daughter's shoes, checking her homework twice, and pretending not to notice how fast she was growing, because noticing made everything feel heavier. His wife had been gone 3 years now, taken suddenly by an illness that left no room for goodbyes, and since then his life had narrowed into a careful balance of responsibility, exhaustion, and quiet purpose. He worked long shifts as a mechanical engineer for a facilities contractor, fixing systems most people never thought about until they failed. Elevators, generators, emergency controls, the invisible machinery that kept buildings alive. And he took extra freelance work whenever he could to afford his daughter's school, because it mattered to him that she felt safe and steady, even when the world hadn't been kind. The backpack Amelia had judged so quickly wasn't clutter or inconvenience. It held a handmade poster for a school fundraiser that evening, glitter still stuck to the edges, her name written in crooked letters, and a note inside reminding him not to forget. That morning in the elevator, Daniel had understood immediately what was happening. He had seen the look before, The quick assessment, the silent ranking, the decision made without conversation, and he had chosen the path he almost always chose, the one that protected his daughter from tension rather than his pride from injury. He apologized not because he was wrong, but because peace mattered more than being right, and when the elevator doors closed, he knelt slightly so his daughter could whisper her question without anyone hearing. Why was she mad? She asked. He smiled, tired but gentle, and told her some people were just having hard mornings, leaving it at that. The rest of his day unfolded predictably. Meetings under fluorescent lights, grease on his hands, problem after problem that needed calm thinking rather than authority. And during lunch, he sat alone, eating quietly, scrolling through photos of his daughter at school, because those few minutes were his reset. That evening, he changed shirts in the restroom of the same corporate building where Amelia worked, smoothing wrinkles before heading upstairs for the fundraiser, a small event held in a rented conference hall, folding tables, paper banners, parents clapping a little too loudly, kids beaming as if the room were a stadium. When the power cut out suddenly, plunging the building into emergency lighting and confusion, Daniel didn't panic. He recognized the sound of the systems failing, the delay in backup generators, the subtle cues most people missed, and when security asked for volunteers to help guide people down the stairs, he stepped forward without thinking, because helping was reflex now, not obligation. He walked the stairwells calmly, reassuring strangers, checking railings, counting steps, aware that fear spread faster than darkness if left alone. He had no idea that somewhere above him the woman from the elevator was trapped, her world shrinking in a way his had already learned to survive. For Daniel, that night wasn't fate or irony or balance being restored. It was just another moment where someone needed steadiness, and steadiness was something he had learned the hard way. What he didn't know yet was that the woman who had dismissed him so easily was about to see the life behind the lunchbox, and that this ordinary night would quietly pull them both into a story neither of them had planned for. The power outage hit the city without warning, the kind that swallowed sound first and then light, and for Amelia Rhodes it happened at the exact moment she was finally heading home after another 14-hour day she told herself was temporary, just like all the others. Her private elevator descended from the top floor in smooth silence until it didn't, jerking once, shuddering again, and stopping so abruptly that her stomach lifted as if the ground had vanished beneath her. The lights flickered, then settled into a dull, emergency glow that flattened everything. Her reflection, the mirrored walls, the illusion of control she carried so confidently through every room she entered. She pressed the emergency button immediately, harder than necessary. Then again, impatience giving way to something unfamiliar when nothing happened right away. Her phone showed no signal, no messages, no calendar alerts demanding her attention, and the quiet pressed in so thickly it made her chest tighten. Amelia had spent her life mastering rooms full of people, but alone in that suspended box she felt exposed in a way she hadn't since the earliest days of her career, before success had insulated her from vulnerability. Minutes stretched, each one heavier than the last, and when the intercom finally crackled to life, the voice on the other end was apologetic and distant, explaining that the outage was citywide, that backup systems were delayed, that she would need to be escorted down the emergency stairs once technicians manually opened the doors. She nodded even though no one could see her, her throat dry, heels suddenly feeling impractical and fragile. When the elevator doors finally parted, the hallway beyond was dim, lit only by emergency strips along the floor, and the air smelled faintly of dust and metal. For a second, she didn't register the man standing there, only the fact that someone was present, that she wasn't alone anymore. Then she looked up. He stood calmly, flashlight angled low so it wouldn't blind her, posture steady, expression focused but kind, and recognition hit her a heartbeat before denial could soften it. It was the man from the public elevator, the one she had dismissed with a sentence and forgotten with a thought, now standing between her and the dark stairwell as if this role had always belonged to him. Amelia's mind scrambled for composure, for authority, for the version of herself that knew what to say, but nothing came. He spoke first, his voice even, unhurried, explaining the number of flights, the pace they'd take, where to hold the rail, not once referencing who she was or who he was to her days earlier. As they stepped into the stairwell, the echo of their footsteps replaced the hum of machinery she depended on without ever noticing, and with every step downward, something shifted. Her breathing faltered once, then again, and without comment he slowed, adjusted, matched her rhythm, until panic loosened its grip. In that dim space, stripped of titles and separation, Amelia became painfully aware of how much she relied on systems she'd never built and people she'd never seen, and how easily she had mistaken visibility for value. She didn't know it yet, but by the time they reached the ground floor, the outage would end more than her elevator ride. It would quietly unplug the version of herself that believed power was protection and replace it with a question she could no longer avoid. The stairwell felt narrower than it should have. Concrete walls closing in as if the building itself were exhaling after years of holding everything up. And Amelia Rhodes realized how rarely she had walked anywhere without glass, speed, or certainty guiding her forward. The man beside her moved with quiet assurance, one hand always near the railing, the other angling the flashlight just enough to show the next steps without flooding the space, and she noticed how deliberate his calm was, not forced, not performative, but practiced through repetition. He explained things simply: how many flights remained, when the landing would widen, where the footing might feel uneven, and he waited for her responses without rushing them, as if time had suddenly become something flexible rather than scarce. Amelia's heels clicked unevenly at first, her breath catching in short, shallow bursts she tried to hide, and when she stumbled slightly on a turn, his hand steadied her elbow with instinctive precision, respectful and firm, withdrawing the moment she regained balance. She expected a comment, a reminder, something that acknowledged the awkward reversal of their roles, but none came. Instead, he matched his pace to hers, slowing when her breathing tightened, pausing briefly when the echo of her heartbeat grew too loud in her ears, until she realized he was managing not just the stairs, but her fear, dismantling it step by step without calling attention to it. The longer they walked, the more the silence shifted from uncomfortable to revealing, filling with the small truths Amelia had spent years avoiding, that control had always been a performance supported by others, that her private elevator was a privilege she had mistaken for independence, that she had learned to measure people quickly because slowing down felt dangerous. She glanced at him in the dim light, finally seeing details she'd ignored before: the faint wear on his jacket, the steady focus in his eyes, the absence of resentment she had almost expected and somehow felt unworthy of. When she finally spoke, her voice came out quieter than she intended, not commanding, not sharp, just human, thanking him for helping, for staying calm, for not leaving her alone with the dark. He nodded, accepting the words without ceremony, as if kindness were not a transaction, but a baseline. By the time the stairwell doors opened onto the ground floor and the air felt lighter, Amelia understood something had shifted permanently, not because she had been frightened, but because she had been seen at her weakest by someone she had once refused to see at all. And as she stepped out into the emergency-lit lobby, she carried with her the uncomfortable certainty that apologies, when they came, would not be enough to undo the moment she had judged a man by the weight of what he carried, rather than the strength it took to carry it. The power returned in stages, lights flickering back to life across the lobby, elevators humming awake as if nothing had happened. But for Amelia Rhodes, the interruption lingered long after the building resumed its rhythm. She stood near the glass doors, watching the man walk away with his daughter, her small hand wrapped around his fingers, as if that connection were the most natural anchor in the world. And something in Amelia's chest tightened in a way no loss on a balance sheet ever had. She turned toward him before thinking better of it, the apology forming without rehearsal, without strategy, and when she spoke, it lacked the polish she usually relied on. She told him she was sorry, not just for the elevator, but for the assumption behind it, for the ease with which she had reduced him to a role he never occupied. He listened without interrupting, his expression open but guarded, then nodded once and accepted it without probing or justification, as if forgiveness were not a victory but a decision to move on. He excused himself gently, his daughter tugging at his sleeve, eager to rejoin the fundraiser that had resumed in a smaller room downstairs. And as they disappeared into the crowd, Amelia felt an unfamiliar emptiness, the kind that followed recognition rather than loss. In the days that followed, she found her attention drifting in ways that unsettled her. Meetings blurred, numbers lost their urgency, and late at night, alone in her office, she replayed the moment in the elevator, the certainty with which she had spoken, the silence she had mistaken for agreement. She did what she had always done when faced with something she didn't understand. She researched, Quietly, carefully, she learned his name, his role as a contractor who serviced the very systems her building depended on, his background as an engineer who had stepped back from advancement to keep his daughter's life stable after his wife's death. Each detail dismantled the narrative she had constructed so effortlessly, and with every correction came a deeper discomfort, because it wasn't ignorance that had driven her behavior, it was habit. Shame settled in not as a sharp pain, but as a steady presence, a reminder that power had insulated her from the consequences of her assumptions for far too long. She began noticing people she had once passed without thought, the quiet competence behind unremarkable appearances, the labor that sustained her world without applause, and with that awareness came a question she couldn't silence, whether she had built her success by climbing past people rather than alongside them. She didn't seek Daniel out immediately, knowing instinctively that guilt demanded patience rather than pursuit, but she found herself hoping their paths would cross again, not to correct the past, but to understand the life she had overlooked. And somewhere in that waiting, curiosity replaced shame, not as an escape from it, but as an invitation to see differently, to listen longer, and to accept that growth often began with the discomfort of realizing how wrong one had been. Their next meeting was unplanned in the way meaningful things often are, a quiet collision rather than an arranged appointment, when Amelia Rhodes spotted Daniel in a small cafe near the building, his daughter perched beside him with a paper cup of hot chocolate, her feet swinging as if the world were lighter than it had any right to be. Amelia hesitated at the door, old instincts urging distance, new ones insisting she stay, and for once she listened to the quieter voice. She approached without titles or agenda, asked if she could sit, and waited for his answer instead of assuming it. Conversation unfolded slowly, without performance, grounded in ordinary details she had once dismissed as insignificant: school schedules, late dinners, the relief of routines that held when everything else failed. Amelia found herself listening more than speaking, learning how to ask questions without steering the answers, how to let pauses exist without filling them. Daniel spoke plainly about his life, the compromises he made willingly, the boundaries he protected fiercely for his daughter's sake, and the pride he took in work that kept people safe even when no one noticed. There was no resentment in his voice, only clarity, and that steadiness challenged Amelia more than anger ever could. When his daughter excused herself to choose a pastry, Daniel looked at Amelia and named the truth gently. That trust wasn't something words could rebuild quickly. That respect showed up in patterns, not apologies. She nodded, accepting the terms without bargaining, realizing that choosing differently meant changing how she moved through the world, not just how she felt about one man. As they parted, there was no promise, no dramatic declaration, just an understanding that something honest had begun. Fragile, but real, contingent on consistency rather than chemistry. Amelia walked back into the city with a lighter step and a heavier responsibility, aware that power could open doors, but character decided who was welcome inside. Daniel returned to his daughter with the quiet assurance that he hadn't compromised the life he'd built, only widened it by one careful degree. Their story did not end with certainty or spectacle, but with two people choosing humility over habit, attention over assumption, and the courage to let connection grow at a human pace, step by deliberate step. If this story made you pause, reflect, or see people differently, subscribe to Drew Daily Stories. We share real, emotional stories that remind us character matters more than status.